Alright, so this is going to be a quick video for anyone who's thinking about getting into tarp camping for backpacking. And I'm going to go over a few of the little lessons I learned in the past 15 years of camping with tarp. So the first one I learned on literally my first night tarp camping. And I had kind of planned this one out carefully to make sure that I wasn't in a really heavy buggy season, so mosquitoes and black flies and things like that. So it was later in the summer in New York State in the Adirondacks, and I got all set up, everything was good, and I got under the tarp, no problem. And then it started to get dark, and I turned on my headlamp, and the thing filled up with moths. So if ever you've been somewhere and you turn on a light and there's moths flying around everywhere, it's pretty annoying. And everyone talks about bugs and tarp camping, but I think most people are thinking about the biting insect, or those are you can deal with in a way and plan in advance and make sure you have the right system. But that was just really annoying. And you got to think about just because you're not in the high bug season for biting insects like mosquitoes or black flies or whatever, you might be in season for something else. So just keep that in mind. Generally speaking, any time that it's going to be above freezing, unless there's been a real freeze already and it's later in the season, I make sure I have some kind of system for bugs. The second thing is getting in and out of a tarp can be kind of challenging, because if you pitch it low enough to give you good protection from the weather, you're basically crawling in and out from one end. And it's not like a tent where you can kind of open the door and sit sideways with your feet out of it with the door all above your head. So it's not like that at all. And it's just something to keep in mind. There's a few tricks to get around that, like folding one half of the tarp back, or what I call opening the door. If you pitch it too low and it does rain, your back gets wet when you're getting in and out of it. So just in general, unless I really have to, I try and pitch the tarp pretty high just to make my life easier to get in and out. And if the weather does go bad, I just kind of lower it a bit. And overall that helps with the weather, helps with the protection, but I do know that getting out is going to be a little bit of a pain. The third tarp issue is that you've got to get used to having your gear on the ground. So when you have a tent, you have this nice little home where you can kind of get in and then just spread all your gear out, and it's all kind of clean, and it's like having this little haven. And if you're tarp camping, you just have to get used to the fact that all your gear is going to kind of spread out onto the ground. And I have some tricks for that. Like I'll often put my rain jacket down with the shell side out, so that I have somewhere to put all my stuff and keep them off the ground if it's damp. And even if it doesn't seem damp, if you leave something on the ground overnight, it's going to get moisture up through it. So if you have electronics or anything like that, you want to protect them with some kind of waterproof, some kind of material that's waterproof. So like, again, I find the rain jacket trick works really well. Or I'll put my backpack with the outside pocket down and the straps up, so that overnight it doesn't get soaked when it's on the ground. Number 4 is wind. And wind is good and bad. So wind is really good if it moves the air through your tarp, keeps condensation down, keeps moisture down. It's really one of the reasons to use a tarp, is for all of that ventilation. But the downside to it is that it can be cold. So it's just something that you do have to get used to, the fact that you'll be in your tent and you'll literally feel, even if you're in a mummy style sleeping bag, you'll literally feel the wind ripping through your tarp sometimes. And and it does mean that you might need a slightly warmer sleeping bag. Now the argument, and this was an argument that was made by Ray Jardine years ago in several of his books, the fact that there's less moisture means that the insulation in your sleeping bag is going to last longer, and it's not going to wet out. And over a multi-day trip, your insulation is going to perform better. And that's why in tents sometimes people do get cold. The first few evenings you feel good because it's kind of a enclosed space and your breath kind of warms up the inside of the tent. But in the long run, that moisture makes your sleeping bag perform less well. Whereas in a tarp, you want to start with a little bit more insulation, but in the long run, the performance should extend over multiple days because you won't have as much moisture. So number 5 is that you get obviously more protection and living space with a bigger tarp. Sometimes you might feel like it's a good idea to just get a huge tarp, and that'll, you know, make sure you don't get wet in the rain. And that's partly true, but there's a point of diminishing returns. So a few things happen as you get a really big tarp. And I'm talking like a 12-foot by 10-foot tarp. Is that it becomes a sail, and it really catches in the wind. And that means that you need potentially side pullouts and things like that. It starts to reduce the weight advantage. You know, if you go out and get a huge tarp that you can camp 4 people under just for one person, so that it completely reduces the risk of getting wet in the rain, well, it's going to weigh 2 or 3 pounds, and you can get a really great tent for that weight. Like at 3 pounds, you can do pretty well in terms of a tent. That being said, I wouldn't suggest for someone who's going to start out tarp camping to get one of these tiny shaped tarps where you have really limited ways to pitch it. A lot of the companies make tapered tarps with a quaternary cut roof line, and there's really only one way to pitch those. It's as an A-frame, and they're really tiny. They look great on paper in terms of weight, but in terms of getting used to tarping, I don't think it's the best way to go. You'll feel pretty exposed sometimes, and in bad weather, it's definitely kind of risky. Those are just some of my experiences with tarp camping. If you're thinking about it, I mean, I'm obviously a big fan of using tarps for backpacking for a lot of different reasons. I have a video on that, you can check that out. I'd be really curious to hear if you have any experience tarp camping that I didn't mention. I might have forgotten them, or might have been just something that I've never lived myself. You can always leave those in the comments.